Hi, my name is Vicki Spriggs. I'm the CEO of Texas CASA, and my guest today is Emily LeBlanc, who is the Chief Program Officer at CASA of Travis County, which is here in Austin. Emily, so good to have you here today. Thank you for coming over.
Of course.
You're with CASA, so you can speak directly to our audience about the connection between a child who's coming out of a home where there has been domestic violence and what we might see behaviorally with that child. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. We see, a lot of the same symptoms of trauma that we would see in other children that we work with who have been directly affected by abuse or neglect. So there's commonly changes in eating patterns, changes in sleeping patterns, difficulty at school, sometimes isolation from friends and family, difficulty concentrating, things that sometimes express themselves and get misdiagnosed as attention deficit disorder or depression, but are more likely related to the trauma that they've witnessed in their homes.
Sure. And I would imagine, and I know this for a fact actually, that you might see more outbursts, behavioral outbursts that might look violent because that's been what's modeled in the home.
Sometimes that's true. Sometimes the opposite is true as well.
Exactly.
Sometimes we see more passive behavior, more protective behavior from children who've witnessed, especially protective parents who've taken care of them in those sorts of incidents.
Okay. So as you work with, or the volunteers work with a child who comes out of a home where domestic violence was the issue, what is your guidance or advice to those volunteers?
I think the most important thing for us to remember is that it is not abuse or neglect to be a victim of domestic violence. The person that's responsible for that abuse is the perpetrator of the domestic violence. And I think oftentimes in Child Protective Services cases, we see mothers who've been abused who are treated more like the perpetrator because they're perceived as failing to protect their children. But when we're assessing a domestic violence situation, we really have to have the context of what that pattern of abuse looks like to be able to tell whether or not the mother was protective. For example, if the perpetrator has told the mother, if you call the authorities, I'll kill you, I'll kill the children, I'll cause further harm to the family, it may be the protective thing for her to not call the authorities. So we really have to know what behaviors were happening in that household that were part of that pattern of power and control and that were part of that perpetrator's abuse to know whether or not the mother responded in a protective way. And then when we develop service plans and make recommendations to the courts, we have to remember that the person whose behavior needs to change is the perpetrator of the violence. And what the victim needs in those situations in order to be a better parent and to be able to protect her children is resources. Oftentimes she's been isolated from friends and family as part of the abuse. She doesn't have access to finances. She needs help finding a job, finding housing on her own, and all of those things are things we can advocate for in the best interest of children, because it's in the best interest of children for their mother, if she's protective, to be alive and well and able to care for them. And oftentimes, because of the way the system is designed, we see really long service plans for moms and not very long service plans for the perpetrators of the abuse. So I think it's important for us as advocates to look at, what are the things that the abuser was doing to undermine the ability of the victim to parent appropriately. Was he keeping her up all night so that she couldn't tend to the children's schedule the next day? Did he limit access to the car so she couldn't provide transportation? Did he limit access to friends and family or to money so that she couldn't adequately provide for the children? And if so, we need to interrupt those patterns with our suggestions to the court about what's in the child's best interest.
That was a mouthful. An appropriate mouthful, but it was a mouthful. So let me ask you some other questions then. What, because this is what the volunteer should know. Was the mother a victim or was she an accomplice? How does the volunteer go about finding that out? Because some of the viewers are brand new volunteers and some are experienced. And so for the ones who don't know, what skill set, what tools, what questions do they need to be asking of who?
I think the first place to start is to read the affidavit and police reports related to whatever incident brought that case into care. You can learn a lot by what's listed by the investigator, And you can find out, was the mother a victim or was there something else going on in the home? Typically, when you see repeated incidents of domestic violence, that's just part of the abuse. It's part of a pattern of power and control that includes emotional abuse, financial abuse, isolation from friends and family, limiting of finances, and controlling who does what in the household. And oftentimes the children are used as a pawn in that. The best way to discover that is to look at any reports that have been made to police, any reports that have been made to CPS, to see what other people are seeing, but also to talk to the parents themselves, talk to the victim. She is the expert on what's been happening in her household and will likely tell us what those patterns are if we ask those questions. The kids often also have seen a lot and can tell us, probably what they're supposed to do when mom and dad fight. And we can get a sense of, does mom have a safety plan? Has she told them to go to the neighbor's house? Is there a cell phone hidden in the closet? There's lots of things that parents do to try to protect their children that we don't know about because it's not safe for us to know about it, or it wouldn't be a safety plan. And so asking some questions of the kids, do they know what to do when their parents fight? Do they know how to keep themselves safe? What have mom and dad told them in the past? And then following the paper trail if there have been reports to know what officers assessed at the scene, what CPS assessed at the scene, and then talking to the other parties on the case to get their assessment of what's going on.
Thank you. What are some of the tools and resources that a volunteer should know about if they're working with a child who is in care because of domestic violence?
I think every volunteer needs to know about the National Domestic Violence Hotline. That's the first place to start to find out what resources are available in your community. And they can look nationwide at a community and tell you where the shelters are and what other counseling services, legal services, things like that are in a specific community. I would also get well acquainted with whatever the shelter or domestic violence center is in your community so that you can build relationships there and call on them for their expertise. You don't have to give details about a case to call an advocate and say, help me think through this. The kid said this, mom said this, what should I be looking for, so that we can gain some of that expertise, but also have that as a resource if that family needs shelter or needs counseling. The other one I would have in my wheelhouse is Texas Legal Services Center. They have a hotline answered by attorneys, and they provide statewide assistance, civil legal assistance to victims of crime. So survivors of domestic violence, if they need representation in getting a protective order, help moving, breaking a lease, many of the civil legal needs that come along with being a victim of domestic violence, they can assist with free of charge. So I think that's a good resource for all of us to know about. We can also call the hotline ourselves and ask questions if we have them.
Super, thank you.
Of course.
What else? If you're a volunteer who has a child in care that's in care because of domestic violence, what else would a volunteer need to know or do or whatever that I haven't asked you?
I think a couple of things. The first, that's a little different in a case of domestic violence than in the other kinds of cases that we're used to working, is to allow for some confidentiality between the victim of domestic violence and her therapist or her advocate. I think we're used to being really good investigators as advocates and as CASA and wanting all of the information, wanting the therapist's notes, wanting to know what the safety plan is. And it's actually not safe for us to always know that information because we have to share information with the other parties on the case. So in a domestic violence situation, sometimes it needs to be enough for us to know that mom has a safety plan and that it's been developed with her advocate at the shelter, and that shelters and domestic violence centers have really strict confidentiality rules that are governed by federal law to keep people safe. And sometimes that feels off-putting to us because we're used to having access to all of the information. But there's a way to work with those providers to get what we need to know to make determinations about best interest. And it may be that we don't need the whole file, we just need to know what mom's goals were in therapy and was she working towards those goals and making progress. And that can be accomplished through conversations and letters instead of therapy notes, for example. It may be enough for us to know that there is a safety plan and that the kids know what the safety plan is, but we don't necessarily need to know the details of where they would flee if the abuser showed up. I think the other thing we have to remember in those cases is that the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence and her children is when she leaves the relationship. And so sometimes victims are in a real bind when a CPS case starts because all of the parties recommend that she leave the relationship, and that's how she gets her kids back. And in recommending that, we're inadvertently putting her and the children in more danger, because even if that separation is caused by a judge or caused by CPS or caused by a criminal case, it still makes them far more likely to be killed by the abuser. And so I think we have to navigate that very carefully and understand that sometimes people are making decisions between staying alive and keeping their children. And if there are ways that we can build enough support around that victim and her children to make it safe for her to parent, then that's what we should be focused on.
You said a mouthful. And I think the thing that popped into my mind as you talked about that heightened point of danger when you start talking about leaving, it occurs to me that supervisors of volunteers need to be very in tune with what's happening with the case so they can advise and counsel the volunteer accordingly to make sure there are no missteps. Have you had, is there anything guidance-wise that you would say to a volunteer supervisor, a volunteer coach, who's working with a volunteer who's got a child who's in care because of domestic violence?
I have very similar advice. I would suggest getting some training. We've trained all of our supervisors at CASA of Travis County on domestic violence dynamics and what to watch for and how to advocate appropriately. And I think one of the best resources in every community is going to be to partner with the Domestic Violence Center in that community. They're often staffed with people who've been working with victims their entire careers and can help navigate situations both one-on-one. You can call hotlines and call the National Domestic Violence Hotline and ask questions even as an advocate, and talk through situations if there's specific questions that you have on a case. But I think knowing and educating ourselves about the general dynamics of power and control and violent relationships so that we can see those patterns when they arise on our cases, but also help educate the other professionals on the case. I think sometimes caseworkers and attorneys, even judges, sometimes don't have a full picture of what that power dynamic looks like in a relationship, and we as supervisors can help educate both our volunteers and the other parties on the case about what we're seeing and why that fits into a pattern of power and control and looks like a domestic violence relationship to us.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us today.
It's my pleasure.
Yes. Well, this has been Emily LeBlanc, who is the Chief Program Officer with Travis County CASA. I thanked her for being with us today, and I want to thank you, too, for joining us with Conversations with CASA. We'll see you next time.